In early December of 1985, in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia, a hunter was very carefully making his way through the trees trying to track a deer. Now, this hunter had been tracking this deer for over a mile, but it had been a while since he had seen any signs of it being anywhere nearby. And as this hunter continued to creep along, he became increasingly aware of how loud each of his steps were, because the ground all around him was covered in dry leaves, and so every step he was taking was creating a loud crunching sound. And so eventually this hunter just came to a stop and decided stalking this deer was totally pointless because he was basically scaring it away with these crunching sounds as he got closer to it. But before this hunter was ready to just give up and head back to his vehicle, he continued on a little bit further, and when he pushed through this particularly dense brush area, he saw this clearing up ahead. And the second he saw what was in this clearing, he froze, took a step back into the brush, and then ducked down behind a rock. Because in that clearing, he saw an animal, and it wasn't a deer. It was a huge American black bear. Now, generally speaking, American black bears are not aggressive towards humans. However, if, for example, you were to accidentally sneak up on a black bear, like this hunter had done, and you suddenly startled it by just showing your presence, the bear might react by pouncing on you and ripping you to bits. And so this hunter, with his back pressed up against the rock and his rifle gripped tightly across his chest, he's thinking about that and wondering what he's going to do to get out of this situation. At first he thought, okay, I'll just stand up and quietly walk away. But then he remembered how loud the leaves were, and even though he had been lucky walking in, he hadn't alerted the bear to his presence, on the way out, he was worried he wouldn't be so lucky, that those leaves would alert the bear to his position. And so the hunter began thinking, okay, well, what if I just stand up and start shooting at this bear? But the hunter knew the big issue with that plan is he had a deer hunting rifle, which is not nearly powerful enough to quickly take down a black bear, if at all. And so if he starts shooting at this bear, there was a very good chance that the bear would just turn around and maul him before he was able to put the bear down with his rifle. And so as this hunter is going through these scenarios behind the rock, he realizes something. He hasn't heard this bear at all. Now, bears in general are very loud animals. Just their regular breathing is so guttural and noisy that you can hear it a pretty good distance away. And the hunter's thinking to himself, I can't hear it breathing, and come to think of it, I haven't heard this bear once since I've been near it. And so the hunter very carefully stood up from behind his rock and turned around, and then he kind of peered forward into the brush, looking back into this clearing, and when he spotted the bear again, he realized immediately the bear was dead. The bear was kind of slumped forward, and its body almost looked like a deflated balloon. The hunter was so relieved, he almost started laughing. And so he stepped out from behind his rock, and he made his way through the brush into the clearing to get a better look at this bear. And when the hunter was right over the top of this bear looking down at it, something immediately struck him as very odd. This bear was far too young to have died of natural causes. However, after this hunter kind of poked and prodded the bear and lifted it up on either side to try to look underneath it, he couldn't see any visible injuries. It was like this bear had just randomly dropped dead. But the hunter didn't spend much time thinking about what happened to this bear. Instead, he thought to himself, there has to be some sort of logical explanation for what killed it, and with one last look at the bear on the ground, the hunter turned around and began the long walk back through the woods back to his vehicle. It would turn out there was an explanation for what happened to that bear. However, it was anything but logical. But to get to that non-logical explanation, we first have to go back in time. Around 11:30 p.m. on September 10th, 1985, so 3 months before the hunter discovered this dead bear, two pilots were flying their little 6-seater Cessna airplane over northern Georgia, making their way north towards Tennessee. And as these pilots flew along very casually, they suddenly intercepted over their radio a voice message that they definitely were not supposed to hear. It sounded like other pilots communicating with each other, and what they were talking about was how they were now going to follow this little Cessna airplane that they could see that was currently flying over northern Georgia. Now, radio traffic like this can only really be intercepted if your radio that's doing the intercepting is physically close to the person doing the transmitting. And so knowing this, the two pilots in this little Cessna knew that whoever was talking about following that little Cessna, they had to be talking about them, the two pilots in that Cessna. Now, for most pilots, if you suddenly overheard a radio transmission that your plane was getting followed by some other pilots, you might reach out to those pilots and say, "Hey, why are you following me? What's going on?" Now, the co-pilot of this little Cessna might have wanted to react that way. However, before he could, the main pilot stopped him and said, "I actually know exactly why somebody might want to tail us, and unfortunately, we're both going to have to jump out of this plane." Before the co-pilot could really even react to this news, the main pilot had set the Cessna on autopilot, which sets the plane to fly in a straight direction going at a constant speed at a constant altitude until either a pilot comes back and takes the craft back over, or if it just stays on autopilot, it eventually will run out of fuel and crash or run into something. And so after the main pilot had done that, he turned to the co-pilot and gestured for him to come with him into the main cabin of the aircraft, basically the main body of the craft where all their luggage was. And the co-pilot, he's so confused about what's happening, he's so panicked that he just follows the main pilot. So the two of them, they climb back over the two front seats, they go into the main body of the craft, and the main pilot begins strapping parachutes onto some of their luggage. And as he's doing this, he tells the co-pilot to open up the side door of the plane. And so again, the co-pilot is just so caught off guard, he has no idea how to handle this, and so he reaches over and he slides open this door of this moving plane. And as soon as he did, this huge rush of cold night air blasted inside of the cabin, and it became so loud from the howling wind coming in that the two pilots couldn't even talk to each other. And then the main pilot just began pushing the luggage out of the plane just into the night, falling straight down to the ground far, far below them. And at some point, the co-pilot just joined him and began pushing the luggage out of the plane. And then after all the luggage was out, the main pilot shoved a parachute into the hands of the co-pilot and said, put it on. He had to gesture for it because they couldn't hear each other. And so as this co-pilot's struggling to get on his parachute, the main pilot puts on his chute, and then right after the co-pilot has just barely got his parachute on, the main pilot pushes him out the side of the plane, and then the main pilot jumps out after him. So they basically abandoned their plane, which was still set to autopilot, so at some point, it was just going to crash. About 5 hours later, in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee, an 85-year-old man named Fred Myers was just waking up. Fred always got up before sunrise. It was part of his daily routine. He would wake up, he would get dressed, he would wash and shave his face, and then he would sit down and read the local newspaper. This simple routine was actually very important to Fred because recently he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive disease that destroys memory. And so having this sort of set routine helped him manage his symptoms. Basically, at least in the morning, he could go into autopilot and go through this routine and not get confused. However, on this particular morning, something would happen that would leave Fred more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. Fred had made it to his bathroom, he had washed his face, and he had begun shaving when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange outside in his driveway. He could see it through a nearby window, but it was still so dark outside, Fred couldn't tell what this thing was out there. And so feeling very curious, Fred put his razor blade down, and he made his way over to the window to get a better look. And when he reached the window and looked out at his driveway and saw what this strange thing was, he could not believe his eyes. There was this huge parachute out on his driveway, and on the parachute was the main pilot of the Cessna. After the main pilot had pushed the co-pilot out and leapt out himself, when he pulled his ripcord, his chute either didn't deploy or when it deployed, it didn't inflate fully, and so he was forced to go to his reserve chute, but it didn't inflate fast enough to stop him from crashing into the ground. And so the main pilot slammed into the ground, basically at terminal velocity, and so he sustained catastrophic internal injuries, and he died within a couple of minutes of hitting the ground. Fred was so stunned and confused at what he was looking at that without saying a word, he just turned away from his window and walked over to his phone and called the police, shaving cream still on his face. When the police arrived at Fred's house that morning, they were expecting to see a dead recreational skydiver on Fred's property. But when they walked up the driveway and saw the dead man for themselves, they knew right away this was not some recreational skydiver. He actually looked more like a soldier. He was wearing a bulletproof vest over some camouflage fatigues, and he had night vision goggles strapped to his head. But the dead man's shoe choice made the police think this guy could not possibly have been military, because on this guy's feet were not military-style combat boots like you would expect with the rest of his getup. Instead, he was wearing loafers, specifically Gucci loafers, so very expensive designer shoes. And so the police are thinking to themselves, who the heck was this guy and what was he doing? The police would figure that out. However, first, we have to fast forward 2 months to late November 1985, so roughly 2 weeks before that bear was discovered by that hunter in Chattahoochee National Forest. Now, at this point in late November, that black bear was alive and well and living a typical black bear life in the Chattahoochee National Forest, which meant he mostly spent his time wandering around the woods looking for something to eat. And on this particular day in November, the bear was doing just that when out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something strange lying on the forest floor. It was one of the pieces of luggage that the 2 pilots had pushed out of their plane. It was this big, heavy duffel bag. Now, the bear had no idea if this duffel bag contained food, but the bear was optimistic, so it meandered its way over and began pawing at the bag with its massive claws, and pretty much immediately, his claws tore open a hole in this bag. And suddenly, the air all around this bear was filled with this glorious, flowery smell, so the bear put its nose directly into this rip in the bag and began sniffing and licking the contents of this bag. And apparently, the bear just loved it because it ate whatever was inside of the bag. All of it. And when he was done, the bear felt so good, he was so full of energy that he just started sprinting in a straight direction. And after running at top speed about 100 yards, every major system inside of this bear shut down all at once and he died on the spot, collapsing in that clearing. And then, about 2 weeks later, that hunter walked into the Chattahoochee National Forest and discovered this dead bear. And then, within 24 hours, the hunter was back home and he told one of his friends about discovering this dead bear. And when he told his friend about seeing this bear, he also kind of casually mentioned that he had seen a duffel bag in the forest not far from this dead bear. Now, to understand what this friend did next, you need some context. By this point in time, the police had actually figured out a lot about that dead man on Fred Myers' driveway, the main pilot of the Cessna. They knew he was a 40-year-old man named Andrew Thornton, who had served in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper, but after getting out of the service, he had kind of gone astray in his life and become a big-time smuggler of illegal goods. The police had also figured out by this point that Andrew, along with a co-pilot, had been the people flying that Cessna that eventually was found crashed into a mountainside in North Carolina. The co-pilot had survived the jump out of the Cessna, and so the police tracked him down, and they very quickly realized this co-pilot was really just a victim of Andrew. Andrew had told this guy they were just going to fly to the Bahamas for a vacation. And so when that plan completely evaporated, and suddenly Andrew is barking orders at this guy to open up the plane and push the luggage out and jump out, the co-pilot said he just totally panicked and just started doing whatever Andrew wanted. And so this guy was just totally terrified, and really all he could offer police was just to confirm that, yup, Andrew was the main pilot, and yes, we really did push his luggage out of the side of the plane over some forest in northern Georgia. The police believed the co-pilot and did not charge him with any crime. The police would go and search all over northern Georgia, and they would find the majority of the missing bags. However, they knew they were still missing some, and they knew they really needed to recover them. And so, around the time that this hunter is telling his friend about this bear encounter and this duffel bag, the police were constantly having news outlets tell people in northern Georgia that if you see one of these duffel bags attached to a big parachute or something, please come forward and tell us. We are looking for these. And so the hunter's friend thought, you know what, that duffel bag he mentioned out in Chattahoochee National Forest, which is in northern Georgia, might be one of those bags. And so the friend called authorities. Authorities were thrilled to get this tip, and so they charged out to the Chattahoochee National Forest, and they made their way out to where this dead bear was, and then sure enough, about 100 yards away from this bear was this bag, and it was one of the bags they were missing. Except the bag was empty, because, as we already know, that black bear had eaten everything inside of this bag. And as you might have guessed, that bag, along with every other bag that had been cast out of the Cessna that night, was full of cocaine. Because Andrew was a drug smuggler. And on the night he and his co-pilot leapt from the Cessna, he was trying to smuggle 900 pounds of cocaine from South America into the United States. That transmission that Andrew and the co-pilot suddenly overheard on their radio as they were cruising along in their Cessna was the sound of federal agents within the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency who had been tipped off about Andrew's big drug run, and so they really had sent 2 planes to go follow him and potentially intercept him. And so the authorities standing in the Chattahoochee National Forest looking down at this empty duffel bag had no idea where the cocaine went that was supposed to be inside of it. But on a hunch, they decided to bring the body of the dead black bear back with them and perform an autopsy on it. And sure enough, during this autopsy, the medical examiner would open up the bear's stomach, and the examiner would say the stomach was, quote, packed to the brim with cocaine, thus ending the mystery of how this bear died. It died from a massive, massive cocaine overdose. But the bear story did not end there. Normally, after an animal is autopsied, they are cremated. But for some reason, this medical examiner decided not to do that, and instead, he had the bear taxidermied, and then he gifted this taxidermied bear to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area. And then from there, the bear changed hands many times. Over the next 2 decades, no one knows exactly who had the bear and for what reason, but there were reports that at least at one point it was stolen from a storage facility, and then it was sold at a pawn shop, and then at some point the bear was in the possession of famous country singer Waylon Jennings, and then finally, the bear found its forever home. Today, the bear is on display at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky, and around its neck is a placard that reads, "Cocaine Bear." So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a ham and cheese sandwich, but don't unwrap the cheese slices. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put up the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it is available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen's Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We post near daily content on Facebook, TikTok, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Buddhists believe that human life is a constant cycle of birth, suffering, and then death. And then you're reborn, you suffer again, you die again, over and over and over again, forever, unless you're able to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana, as it's called. However, no one really knows what nirvana actually is, what it looks like, what it feels like, where it is. Buddhists will say that the only way to actually understand nirvana is to experience it yourself. It's kind of like trying to describe to someone what chocolate tastes like. You can use any number of superlatives to describe the flavor, but until that person bites a piece of chocolate, they won't really fully understand it. And so, the goal of all Buddhists is to try to attain nirvana. And every day, hundreds of millions of Buddhists all around the world try very hard to do just that. But within Buddhism, there is a small subset of practitioners who have effectively dedicated their entire existence to attaining nirvana. And these people are the famous Buddhist monks. It is extremely difficult to become a Buddhist monk because the sacrifice is enormous. You have to leave your family, your friends, society, all your possessions, your name, your status, everything, and go live in a monastery, which is a kind of isolated place where monks live, and there you will spend your life living this very simple, very strict religious life where basically all you do is try to attain nirvana. As a result of this extreme lifestyle that Buddhist monks live, they have developed a reputation for being some of the most disciplined people on the planet. But even by Buddhist monk standards, their sacred ritual of Sokushinbutsu takes discipline to a whole nother level. Last week, our company decided that we needed to hire a graphic designer, and so I got tasked with finding candidates. Now, I got no idea how to do that, and so naturally, I went on Google and I looked up, where can I find good graphic designer candidates? But I accidentally wrote malnourished, angry saltwater crocodiles instead of good graphic designer candidates, an easy mistake to make. But because I didn't catch it, before long, me and old Singo Lung were stuck up in northern Australia up to our lacrimal puncta in Crocodilus porosus. Now, of course, me and Lung did our best to try to calm these beasts down and try to teach them graphic design to make the most of this work trip. But these salties were just not that interested in graphic design, and they lacked basic finger dexterity. And so, it was as we were sitting up in this tree, hiding from this bask of angry salties down below, that old Lung jumped up and threw a javelin directly into my heart and said, "Apa miertnem hesnalod ZipRecruiter," which of course in Hungarian means, "Dad, why didn't you just use ZipRecruiter?" And boy was old Lungy right. ZipRecruiter uses its powerful technology to both find and match the right candidates to your job. ZipRecruiter also has a user-friendly dashboard with a full suite of tools that will allow you to filter, review, and rate your applicants all in one place. And now, with the invite to apply feature, it lets you immediately access a list of candidates with qualifications that match your job description. See a candidate who'd be perfect for your job? ZipRecruiter makes it easy to send a personal invite to them and other top choices. See how much easier hiring is with ZipRecruiter, which is the #1 rated hiring site according to G2 satisfaction ratings as of January 1st, 2022. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And now you can try ZipRecruiter for free by going to ZipRecruiter.com/MrBallen. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/MrBallen. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Okay, back to the story. Sokushinbutsu was created over 1,000 years ago up in the rugged mountains of northern Japan by a sect of Buddhists called the Shingon. And the Shingon believed that you could attain nirvana through physical punishment. And out of that idea was born the incredibly brutal Sokushinbutsu ritual. In short, Buddhist monks can choose to participate in this ritual, and if they successfully complete it, they might attain nirvana. But they won't know until the ritual is over. Meaning it's kind of like a big gamble. Put yourself through absolute hell, and maybe you have this huge payoff, but maybe not. However, trying to attain nirvana through other means was really difficult. There was no other really clear pathways to nirvana, and so having this one distinct pathway, no matter how difficult it was really appealing. And so since its creation, hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist monks have tried it. And maybe less than 100 have actually successfully completed it. And then of that 100 or less, only 24 have actually attained nirvana through this process. The instructions for Sokushin Butsu are actually quite simple. There are 3 phases. Phase 1 is called Moku Jikagayo, which roughly means tree-eating training, and it's primarily focused on the monk's diet. It takes 1,000 days to complete this phase. However, most monks go much longer than 1,000 days. During this phase, monks will only eat byproducts of trees, things like seeds, nuts, tree bark, tree roots, pine needles, and they will collect all this food on their own. It should be noted, though, that some monks in this first phase will ingest small rocks. This is likely done because they are starving and they can't find food, and by eating the rocks take up space in their stomach and kind of curb their appetite a little bit. But because they don't actually digest the rocks, they're not technically breaking the phase 1 diet restrictions, and so they can continue on with this ritual. Additionally, during this first phase, the monks adhere to a very involved and strenuous physical exercise routine, and then whenever they're not foraging for food or exercising, they are meditating. At the end of the 1,000th day of phase 1, if the monk has survived, because sometimes phase 1 monks do die mostly from starvation, it is up to them if they are ready to move on to phase 2. This decision ultimately comes down to whether or not, 1, the monk actually adhered to the strict rules of phase 1, something really only that monk would know, and then 2, whether or not the monk actually believes they are spiritually ready to move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is much shorter than phase 1, but it is significantly more challenging. And so the monks going into phase 2, they really need to kind of bring their A game and have no second thoughts. They need to be fully committed to phase 2 in order to successfully complete it. For reference, most of the 24 monks who successfully attained nirvana through this ritual repeated phase 1, 2, or even 3 times just to make sure they really were ready. Phase 2 is called Nyojo, and it roughly translates to deep meditation. But a better way to think about what this phase entails is these monks need to enter into a sort of trance-like state, almost like an out-of-body experience, because what they're going to go through in this phase is so physically uncomfortable that unless you're able to kind of detach mentally, there's just no way to go through with it. And so during the second phase, the monks will sit down and meditate basically constantly for 100 straight days. And during that time, they don't eat any more tree byproducts or rocks. Instead, they have a liquid diet. They drink a little bit of salt water, and they drink a lot of a very particular kind of tea. The tea is made from Toxicodendron verniculum tree bark, which contains the same toxin in poison ivy. Meaning, for phase 2, you basically just sit alone by yourself for 100 days while simultaneously drinking a poisonous tea that causes a massive allergic reaction inside of your throat and stomach that causes an intense itching sensation inside of you that you cannot physically itch. Also, this poisonous tea gives you explosive diarrhea and it makes you vomit a lot. If you somehow manage to survive all 100 days of phase 2, and unfortunately many monks don't, you automatically move on to phase 3. Unlike phase 1, phase 2 never gets repeated, most likely because it almost certainly would be fatal to do so. Phase 3 is either the easiest or the hardest part of the Sokushin Bitsu ritual, depending on how you look at it. It doesn't have a name like the other 2 phases, perhaps because so few people make it to this part of the ritual, but regardless, phase 3 definitely has a strict set of rules like the other 2 phases. The phase 3 monk has a small pine box that has no windows built just for them. It needs to be big enough that they can sit inside of it in the lotus pose, which is how they typically sit when they're meditating. And then once it's all built, the monk climbs into this box. They put a lid over the top of it, but they put a bamboo shoot, like a bamboo pole, through the cover of this box. So there is a breathing tube for this monk inside of this box. And then they lower the monk inside of the small pine box 10 feet into this hole in the ground. And then once they ensure the bamboo pole is going to be above ground so they can breathe, they fill the hole in with charcoal. Before we cover what happens next in phase 3, you need some context about what this ritual is actually doing to the monks performing it. Phase 1, tree eating training, serves two purposes. The first is it's kind of like a big gut check. It really shows who wants to do this ritual and who doesn't. It's kind of like if you can't complete phase 1, you certainly can't complete phase 2 or phase 3. So it's like a filter. It weeds out the weak monks. The second purpose of phase 1 is to literally shrink the monk. The tree-eating diet, combined with the constant physical exercise, removes all of their body fat and a lot of their muscle. And so they're incredibly lean by the end of phase 1. And this will be significant when we talk about the end of phase 3. Phase 2, deep meditation phase, serves two purposes as well. The first purpose is that it puts the monk into that trance-like state, and then the second purpose it serves is the toxin inside of this poisonous tea kills off all of the naturally occurring bacteria and parasites inside of the monk. Again, that will become significant when we get to the end of phase 3. Speaking of which, so in phase 3, the monk is put in their box, they're lowered 10 feet into the ground, the breathing bamboo shoot is installed, the charcoal is dumped on top of them, and then for several days, the third phase monk will sit in total darkness and meditate constantly, and each day, they have a bell down there with them, they ring the bell. That's the only thing they have to do besides meditate. And above ground, there is a team of monks that are supporting this ritual, and they're listening for that bell. And the first day they don't hear the bell, it means the monk in the box has completed the ritual, and now it is time to see if they have attained nirvana. In Buddhism, someone whose body does not decay, aka a mummy, is someone who has cheated death. And to cheat death is to remove yourself from the vicious human life cycle of birth, suffering, death, repeat. Meaning, becoming a mummy is a way to attain nirvana. And Sokushin Butsu is a self-mummification ritual. Phase 1 shrinks the monk's body, it removes their fat and muscle, it also removes a lot of moisture inside of their body, and their diet also withholds nutrients to all of the bacteria and parasites that naturally occur inside of their bodies. And so those bacteria and parasites that normally would play a big role in helping decompose your body after death begin to die off. And so the cumulative effect of phase 1 on these monks is that if they were to die at the end of phase 1, their decomposition would be drastically slowed. It wouldn't be mummy status, but it would be close. The phase 2 poisonous tea, that toxin that they're drinking, that kills off the remainder of the bacteria and parasites that did not die during phase 1. Also, all the vomiting and diarrhea completely dehydrates them, which aids in slowing down decomposition after death. Finally, phase 3 is the death phase. The monk goes into their tomb, they're buried underground, and they ring that bell each day to tell the people on the ground that they are still alive. And then when the bell stops ringing, it means the monk in the box is dead. At which point the crew on the ground removes the bamboo breathing pole and then lets the body sit in the box underground for another 1,000 days. And then after 1,000 days, they pull the box up, they lift the lid off, and if there is little to no signs of decay on their body, it means the self-mummification ritual worked, they're a mummy, they've attained nirvana, and now their body is holy. And so they're brought out of the box, they're dressed in robes, they're placed in the monasteries, and they are worshipped. As for the unlucky monks who get to the end of Sokushin Butsu, but are found to be decomposing inside of their box when they're brought back up again, they're just placed back inside of their pine box and buried, and they are not worshipped. Sokushin Butsu was made illegal in Japan in the late 19th century, but we know monks continued to practice it into the 20th century, and in theory, today, monks still might practice it in secret. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is counting something really important, start shouting out random numbers to mess them up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered versions of our best YouTube videos. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen's Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. To check out our merch, to join our Discord server, to see what events are coming up or what announcements are coming out of our studio, go to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. It was 2 days before Christmas in 2010, and 54-year-old Alan Catterall, along with his future son-in-law Mark, were sitting in the break room of a kayak molding facility in the United Kingdom where they both worked. And as they sat there drinking tea, they began exchanging notes about what gifts they got for the rest of their family for the holidays. And as they spoke, they both were very careful to keep their voices very quiet in fear that someone might overhear them, because Alan's wife and daughter also worked at this kayak company. Alan had worked for this company for 10 years, and even though it was backbreaking work a lot of the time, he loved it because it meant he got to spend all this time with his family basically 24/7. It was only 7 a.m., which meant Mark and Alan had just started their shifts, but they were already taking this break to talk about Christmas because they were so excited about it. But they finally said, okay, we do need to go to work, and so they put their cups in the sink, and then Alan made his way down to the factory floor, and his future son-in-law Mark made his way up to the control room. On the factory floor, where Alan was heading, was where all the special machinery was inside of these little rooms where the kayaks were actually molded and put together. And it was Alan's job to make sure the machinery was clean and operational. The machinery inside of these little kayak making rooms was very customized and very finicky, and so Alan was one of the few people at the company who really understood what made it work and what would cause issues, and so he was very valuable at the company. That day, Alan knew one of the circuit boards for one of these molding rooms had shorted out, and so the leadership had decided to shut down that particular molding room while the circuit board was fixed. And so when Alan went down and began checking out each of these molding rooms, he knew which one had been shut down. So he knew when he went in there, it was not going to be operational. But when he went into that particular molding room, he noticed that it really needed a good clean. When these kayaks were made inside of these molding rooms, a lot of times the excess plastic would kind of seep out of the actual mold, and it would get caked to the walls, and it would flake all over the ground. And so periodically, Alan would clean these rooms, and he figured right now, with this one shut down, he might as well clean it. And so Alan grabbed a crowbar, and he headed into this shut down molding room, and he got to work chipping all this plastic off the walls and making a big pile on the ground to sweep out and throw away. But as Alan chipped away at all the plastic, the doors leading into this molding room shut. And so suddenly Alan was cast into total darkness because his only light before that had been coming through these doors. But that was the least of Alan's worries. He knew that if these doors were shutting, these doors were automatic, that meant that the circuit board had to have been fixed, and they didn't know he was in here. And so now this molding room must be operational, which meant he only had minutes to get out of this room. And so Alan ran to the door, and with his crowbar, he began trying to pry the doors open, but he couldn't. These are mechanically sealed doors. They do not just open. You need to press a button to release them. But Alan's in a total panic. He knows what happens in this room, and he just can't get the doors open. And so he began banging on the door with his crowbar and screaming for anybody out in the factory floor to please stop this process that's surely starting inside of this room. Open these doors, get me out of here. But it was so loud out on the factory floor, nobody heard him. And so before long, Alan must have looked around and saw the walls inside of this tight, cramped space beginning to glow red. Because this molding room was actually just an oven. It reached almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit in about 10 minutes. And so Alan is watching as this oven is restarting, and he's sealed inside of it. And so the walls turned bright red, and then before long, the crowbar he was using to try to open the door must have become so hot he couldn't have held it. And then the ground as well would have been red hot, and his shoes would have begun to melt. And then the air temperature inside would have gotten so unbelievably hot, he couldn't have breathed. And so screaming in pain and pounding on the door, leaving his skin on the door every time he hit it, Alan eventually just collapsed to the ground in unimaginable pain as he cooked alive. Finally, when Alan caught on fire and black smoke began coming off of his body and pouring out onto the factory floor, the factory realized there's a problem with this molding room, so they turned it off, they opened it up, and they discovered Alan. It would turn out, after Mark and Alan had chatted about Christmas in the break room and then parted and gone their own ways, Alan had gone down to the factory floor and inside of that molding room, and his future son-in-law, Mark, had gone up to the control room where he would have no visibility of the factory floor. All he had was this big switchboard full of lights and switches and gauges that controlled all of the molding rooms. And not long after he got up there and was looking at the control panel, he saw a blinking light come on. And it was for the molding room that Alan was working inside of. And that blinking light meant someone had fixed the circuit board, and so that molding room now had power. And so reflexively, Mark just turned it on. And when he did that, the molding room began its restart process, which included sealing its doors and turning on the oven. And inside of that molding room, there were no safety escapes. In fact, there was really no safety precautions at all with regards to these ovens. And so as soon as Mark flipped that switch, he had killed his future father-in-law. 5 years later, the Kayak Molding Company was convicted of corporate manslaughter and fined 200,000 pounds. Also, the man who actually designed these molding rooms with no safety precautions in mind, no emergency exits, nothing, he was fined 25,000 pounds and sentenced to jail for 9 months. On the evening of October 28, 2006, in a Florida city called Port Richey, a 37-year-old woman named Marisa Weber walked in the front door of her home and called out a greeting to her mom. Her mom didn't call back, but Marisa could hear her in the kitchen making dinner, and so Marisa walked over to say hello. But Marisa only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marisa over as it ran past her and ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared at the baseboard of the wall like there was something there. Marisa was totally annoyed by this cat, and as she looked over at it, she knew what it was doing, because lately Marisa had noticed there were clearly rats in her family's home, kind of scurrying around in the ceilings and the walls. Marisa could hear them all the time, and one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. And this totally stressed Marisa out. She'd actually begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication largely because of this rat infestation, and really just the fact that Marisa hated living at her parents' home, but she didn't really have the means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem, and so she was just kind of stuck here. And so Marisa turned away from the cat and likely the rat behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen, and she gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. And then Marisa's mom offered her some food, but Marisa said, you know what, I'm not hungry, thank you. I'm just tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And so Marisa again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marisa's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day, but Marisa did not come downstairs, and so the parents assumed she must have left early for her job. Marisa was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marisa did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then because they figured, okay, well, maybe she left early and she came home from work early, and so we just kind of missed her on both ends, and that's why her door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early and she's in there and she wants to be left alone. After all, she's a 37-year-old woman. She probably wants her space. But later that night, when still the parents had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marisa's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marisa's mom opened the door and the room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned because they're thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning. We haven't seen her now. We don't know where she is. But again, their daughter is 37 years old. And if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now. And in the morning, they were sure to see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marisa, she had not come home, and now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marisa might have been kidnapped or something going to or coming back from work because Marisa was only 5'3" tall and maybe 100 pounds, so she was really small. And so Marisa's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, your sister, she's missing. We don't know where she is. She might have gotten kidnapped. Come over and help us figure out what's going on. And so Gina came over to the house. And when she came inside, she told her parents, let's stay calm here. Marisa, she's 37. I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's some note or something from Marisa explaining where she is and what she's doing. And so the family searched the whole house, starting with Marisa's room, but they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what happened to Marisa. But they did eventually find Marisa's purse that was still in her room, and when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They're thinking, why would Marisa go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police, and they reported Marisa missing. But the police got nowhere on the case, and so on November 9th, so 12 days after Marisa had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, the family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marisa's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marisa, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy, she was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina's thinking that it was totally possible that Marisa had just abruptly run away, or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. And so on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marisa's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marisa's room. And so Gina, she went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom, and she walked inside, and you gotta picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a human person. This room is totally packed with stuff. But Gina, she took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, kind of sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything in the room, and she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf. And she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd right in the middle of the shelf. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw it, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marisa Weber on October 28th, 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marisa had come home. She saw her mom and dad in the kitchen. She was offered food. She turned it down and said, I'm tired. I'm going to bed. She went upstairs. She went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marisa grabbed a pill bottle next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, which are two very powerful painkillers. They're opiates, so highly addictive. She popped a few of those, And then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that. And then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed, getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marissa knew that the TV likely had become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marissa was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle loose the plug from the TV. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookcase that was pressed right up against the bureau. But this bookcase was so loaded down with books and things that Marissa had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marissa, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau and she reached back behind the 6-foot-tall bookcase and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug. But when she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny space behind the bookshelf and the wall, and she got pinned upside down. Now, we don't know why Marissa didn't begin calling out for help. Perhaps she was so under the influence of these drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten trapped upside down behind her bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. It causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head's going to explode. But the real problem is all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts your lungs and makes it really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so Marissa did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she didn't have the lung capacity to call out for help. And so likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marissa remained upside down behind this bookshelf and likely was aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention, and so eventually she died. Marissa's family would say when they were looking for Marissa in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they said they did hear sounds, but it sounded like the rats that were running all over their house. And so they didn't know it was actually likely Marissa moving around behind the bookcase, trying to get their attention because she can't use her voice. And then after Marissa died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marissa decomposing. But the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy. And again, there are rats in this house. I mean, this was not a clean space. And so they kind of thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th when Marissa's sister, Gina, was back in Marissa's bedroom and she looked over at the bookcase and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot right behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down, she realized it was her sister. On the night of May 29th, 2007, a 29-year-old man named Romy Baligula sang to himself as he and a big group of his friends wandered into a karaoke bar in the city of San Mateo in the Philippines. Life had not been easy lately for Romy, but tonight he was feeling good. He and his buddies had begun drinking alcohol about an hour earlier, and so he already had a nice buzz as he walked into this bar. He had a brand new shirt on, and for the first time in weeks, Romy actually had money in his pocket. Romy had lost his job a couple of months earlier, and since then, he had not been able to find new employment. And so this city he was living in, San Mateo, even though it was one of the wealthiest places in all of the Philippines, It was also known as a place that had lots of poverty and really no safety net for people that fall on hard times. And so if you lose your job, like Romy had, you could find yourself out on the streets really quickly looking for scrap metal to sell and dumpster diving just to find your next meal. And that's exactly what Romy had been doing for the better part of the last 2 months. He had been living out on the streets. But just a day earlier, he had discovered this stash of very valuable scrap metal, and he had sold it that day for a nice profit. And with that money, he had bought a nice big dinner, a brand new shirt, and tonight he had bought a night out. And the best kind of night out for Romy was going to a karaoke bar. Because Romy loved to sing, and his friends did too, but Romy sang basically all the time. Whether he was full-time employed, making lots of money, enjoying life, or if he was in a dumpster looking for food to eat, Romy would be singing. Now, Romy was not the best singer, certainly not compared to some of his friends who were excellent singers, but he felt like the more he sang, the better he got. And he was kind of proud that he felt like he was progressing and becoming a better and better singer. And Romy's favorite songs to sing were these big ballads. He just loved to close his eyes and let the words of the story kind of take him away. It really was his escape. It was like no matter how bad his life got, he could always sing and that would make him feel better. Once Romy and his friends went inside the karaoke bar, they made their way across the very crowded space to the far side of the bar. They found 2 unoccupied tables, they pushed them together, they all sat down, and then they ordered a round of beers. And then after the beers came, the friends all did a toast to their wonderful night out they were having, and then one by one, each of Romy's friends began getting up and making their way over to the karaoke machine and began going through all the music and deciding which songs they were going to sing that night. One of Romy's friends chose an American country song. Another one of his friends chose a pop song from the 1980s about unrequited love. But regardless of the songs that any of Romy's friends chose, when they began getting up there and singing their song, it was like the karaoke bar came alive. People in the Philippines love karaoke. It's really a part of the culture. In fact, many people in the Philippines have a karaoke machine of their own in their house. And so what that means is in karaoke bars like the one Romy was at, the crowd is both really appreciative of good singers who go up there and do karaoke really well, and everyone will get up and cheer and dance along. And then also, if there are bad karaoke singers, the crowd is just as quick to begin jeering and booing at them and getting them to stop. And Romy knew that when he went up on stage that night, he was taking a bit of a risk, because when he went up and identified the song that he was going to sing, he knew it was a questionable choice. But he was confident in his abilities. He had been singing and practicing. He really felt like he was ready to nail this really challenging song, and the crowd was going to love him for it. As Romy sat at the table watching one of his friends perform a fast-paced song about a race car, the bar's bouncer, a 43-year-old man named Robalito Ortega, came over to Romy's table with a big grin on his face. Robalito didn't recognize Romy or his friends. They were new at this bar, and so Robalito wanted to introduce himself and get to know these people. One, because Robalito was a big karaoke enthusiast, just like everybody else was. And two, Robalito felt like it was easier to keep the peace in this bar when everybody knew him and he knew everybody. And so Romy and his friends, they chatted happily with Robalito, and then after Romy's friend, who was singing the song about the race car, wrapped up and came down off the stage, Robalito gave him a nice congratulatory pat on the back and told the friend he did a great job up there. And the friend, in turn, turned around and flagged down the bartender at the other side of the bar and kind of gestured, hey, we want another round of drinks. And the friend also made it clear that he wanted to give a drink to the bouncer as well, as like a thank you to the bouncer for giving him the compliment. And the bouncer said, thank you very much. And then before long, the beers arrived, and Romy and his friends and the bouncer, they all cheersed and toasted the night and enjoyed their drinks together. And then just a couple of minutes later, it was Romy's turn to take the stage. And so he got up and, as confidently as he could, kind of jogged up onto the stage, and he took the microphone and he looked out at the crowd. And everybody's having a great time. It seemed like the mood was really positive, and Romy really felt like, again, even though this song was a questionable song choice, that this crowd was going to love it and that he was going to do a wonderful job. But when the song began to play in the background, Romy noticed that right away, the mood in the bar completely shifted. It went from loud, happy, and talkative to almost silent as everybody in the bar turned and looked up at the person who had chosen this song. But Romy had anticipated this, and he knew as soon as he actually began singing this song that he could win them over. He was going to nail this song. And sure enough, Romy began to sing, and right away, it was like the mood began to kind of return to what it was. People in the audience could tell that Romy was doing a good job, and so about a third of the way into his song, Romy noticed that the bar was basically back to normal. He even looked over and saw the bouncer, who was still standing with his friends over at the table, had raised his beer, kind of saying, "Keep it up, you're doing great." And when Romy saw the bouncer really getting into it, Romy had this surge of adrenaline, and suddenly he felt so confident that he really leaned into the song. And so he began dancing on stage and really belting out each of the lines of the song. But at some point in the song, there's this moment where the singer really needs to hit a high note. And when Romy very confidently attempted to hit this high note, his voice cracked, and it was a really loud, like obvious cracking of his voice, and it kind of threw Romy off rhythm, and he couldn't really get back on rhythm. And so right away, the audience reacted by going quiet again and looking angrily up at Romy like, "We knew you were going to screw this up. This was a bad choice." And Romy actually looked over and saw the bouncer, and now the bouncer had his beard down and he's glaring angrily at Romy like, "What are you doing?" But Romy, even though he was kind of faltering here, he did his best to kind of regain his composure because he knew he had practiced this song so many times. He knew he could do it, and he tried so hard to get back on track, but he just couldn't do it. And it was around this point that he looked back at Robolito, the bouncer, and all he would have seen is Robolito angrily belting out the words of this song, almost like he was trying to override how badly Romy was singing it. And then at some point, as Romy is staring at Robolito, while singing this song, pulls out a gun, aims it at Romy, and fires. In the Philippines, there is one song that everybody knows you do not sing. In fact, this song is often banned in most karaoke bars, and then even when it's not banned, nobody sings it. And the reason this song is so forbidden is because since 1998, people have begun being murdered for singing it. Reasons unknown, but it just keeps on happening. Since 1998, 12 people have been murdered either while they were singing this song for karaoke or immediately after it. The forbidden song is called My Way by Frank Sinatra, and that was the song that Romy chose. Now, no one really understands why this song somehow elicits all this violence in people in karaoke bars in the Philippines, but it does. Some have said that the message of the song, which is about a man being a man and doing it his way, kind of brings out a lot of masculine energy amongst people that are listening to it, and it can apparently prompt people to just suddenly start acting violent. But that's just a theory. No one really understands why this song just keeps leading to murders. But on May 29th, 2007, when Romy sang this song, Robolito, the bouncer, who liked Romy and liked his friends and was having a nice drink with them, he just couldn't handle it when the song was getting butchered, and he hated the song to begin with. And in fact, ironically, Robolito had been hired by that karaoke bar specifically to keep the peace if the song were to come on. But as he listened to this song, something happened inside of him, and he pulled his gun and shot and killed Romy. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories just like the ones you listen to that are available right now. You can listen to the podcast, which again is called the MrBallen's Podcast, exclusively on Amazon Music.